Oh my gosh, you guys. Welcome back to the Counteract podcast. My name is Allison Lind. I'm a New York City cell leader for Counteract USA, and I'm also a host of the pop culture segment on this podcast. I'm so excited you're joining me today. I am genuinely so excited for this episode. When I tell you, I wrote this episode probably about 2 years ago, like right around the time that Roe v. Wade was overturned. Actually, it was early 2023 when I went to my first March for Life and got canceled by everyone. I wrote this episode basically to explain why I'm pro-life and what changed my mind. I was not always pro-life. I just think it's really important to get into the nitty-gritty details of the argument. And so I wanted this to be at least from my perspective, a complete Christian pro-life perspective on the topic. But before we get into the episode, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Give the episode a like and a review. It will really help our ratings because, we be getting shadow banned out here. Also follow Counteract USA on Instagram. And without further ado, let's get into it. Yay. Today I'm going to be talking about how I went from pro-choice to pro-life and what changed my mind. I think this is a super important topic to talk about as we get into 2024. We're only months away from our major presidential election, and I really think that this year is going to be just as pivotal as the last two elections have been. And since 2022, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, it basically solidified that abortion will be one of our main divisive and contentious issues on the ballot this year, even 2 years after its undoing. I believe that we as Christians need to understand this the most, and we need to understand that it's not just a legal battle this year, because Roe v. Wade was brought down, but it is a spiritual battle. We saw a 50-year precedent of abortion being a constitutional right come crashing down in just one day. However, the precedent in the hearts and minds of our nation still remains, and it is our duty as Christians to speak the truth of this issue with grace, love, and compassion towards our neighbors who may or may not be able to speak up for themselves. So let's jump in. I've had a lot of assumptions made about me and what I believe. I've lost a lot of followers, a lot of friends after I started speaking up, and I've been called a lot of ugly things, and I've had my character attacked. And I don't believe that people mean it. I don't believe that people hate you for being pro-life. They have just been told by the media their whole lives this binary narrative about topics like this and the people who believe in them. But the truth is, I was not raised pro-life. My views do not reflect the personal views of my parents or even the views of my childhood church growing up. I grew up believing what was said on social media, that the pro-life movement is run by a bunch of white men who hate women and want to control them and even see them killed. I believed that abortion was the only loving answer to the crisis of a woman facing an unplanned pregnancy. So in my senior year of high school, I was in a writing class, and we were told to write a persuasive essay, and for some crazy reason, I chose abortion. I really didn't even know what I believed about it, except that I was pro-choice. And I knew it was a hot button topic in America, so I think I really chose it just because I was about to be able to vote and I wanted to understand it more. So I jumped in thinking I was going to write a pro-choice essay, and it was going to be this beautiful academic activist literature piece. But I tried to approach my research from a critical and neutral perspective, and that really backfired. That really backfired, guys. I'm going to be giving all the rundown of the three main focal points of the debate and what we as Christians should be able to talk about in regards to it. So the first is the scientific and philosophical debate of life in the womb. The second is understanding what the industry actually does to and for women. And then lastly, we have to understand what the Bible says about it and what God says and what his will is and what his love is for us as his creation. We have to be able to communicate that effectively and truthfully and compassionately. So those are my 3 points, and they're really the 3 things that I had my mind changed on. So I'm just going to jump into it. The first argument is an old argument, and it is the argument that you are not pregnant with a baby. It's just a clump of cells. This is the very foundation of the debate. And it lies in where we believe life begins. I really genuinely think this is the number one contention point between pro-choice and pro-life. Most of the women I've talked to will agree with me on like every other thing that I'm going to go through in this episode, but we cannot agree when life begins. And so it still comes down to like, whose choice is it, right? And to be honest, I always thought that life began somewhere later in pregnancy, like when you started showing is kind of when I thought. And I truly believe that in the beginning, maybe it was just a clump of cells. They didn't have cognizance. They didn't have a heartbeat. They didn't have, they couldn't breathe, whatever. I thought there was no consciousness, and so therefore there was no value. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But yep, that's what many pro-choice lobbyists and abortionists want you to believe, is that it is just a clump of cells in the beginning. It's not a human being. It's not a baby. There should be no moral issue with ending your pregnancy. The feminist account actually posted an image of what they believe is what pregnancy actually looks like before 10 weeks in pictures. And it's just all these little cell tissues, which will be inserted, and they run through the weeks. Like, I think it's like 5 to 10 weeks. What they do not want to tell you is that this is a post-aborted fetus, including the placenta. So of course it's going to look like just a little clump of cells because they've already administered the medication that essentially detaches it from the womb and comes out as a blood clot. And then they can take that, put it under a microscope and study it and say, oh, that's all it is. It's just a clump of cells. But they don't want to tell you that this is after the baby has been aborted. So they posted that back in like 2022, I think, after all the Roe v. Wade stuff. But I wanted to show you guys some photos of what a baby actually looks like in the different stages of pregnancy. I'm also going to run through the gestational stages. So our first image is an embryo at approximately 6 to 7 weeks. And you will see that at this point, there is a mouth, there are eyes. You can even count some little fingers and the beginnings of toes. You see a spinal cord. You see brain matter beginning to develop. You see a little belly. I'm going to not get emotional during this episode. I'm not going to do it. There's one where it looks like the baby is like starting to smile and like suck on its thumb. And that's only at 6 to 7 weeks. They even show an ectopic pregnancy at 6 to 7 weeks, and the baby looks exactly the same because what you have is an embryo or a fetus, which, by the way, fetus is just the Latin word for offspring, meaning it's a stage of human development. It's not like this other thing that isn't us. I'm a fetus to my mother. Even to this day, I'm her offspring. So don't let them fool you with that it's just a fetus in there. Or just an embryo. These are all stages of human development. And so what we see here is an embryo or a fetus that, unless otherwise stopped by either unnatural causes or something like an illness, natural issues that come along in pregnancy, this is a life that will continue to grow unless otherwise stopped. And you can already see that it resembles a human being. And that's where we're going to jump in to the stages of pregnancy. Fertilization is conception. It's when the egg and the sperm become an embryo, one entity, thus creating an entirely unique genetic code of DNA that has never been created before and will never be created again. And this is when I believe, and most pro-life people believe, that life begins. And the pro-choice movement will want to tell you that, like, that's not when life begins. But what they really mean is that that's not when they deem a human being an actual person. And we'll get into the personhood debate in a bit. First, we're going to continue on. So 1 to 4 weeks, the baby is developing pretty steadily. That's when the placenta is forming, spinal cord, brain, all of the things we saw in that 6 to 7 week embryo. At 5 weeks, the heartbeat has begun. It actually begins as early as 21 days into pregnancy. As I mentioned, brain, spinal cord, and nerves have actually been forming in those first 5 weeks. At 6 weeks, you can hear the heartbeat of the baby. At 8 weeks, there are arms, legs, webbed fingers, toes, and knees. The respiratory system is formed and the nerves are beginning to spread. Week 10, is the FDA approved cutoff point for the abortion pill, meaning any time up until your 10th week of pregnancy, you can take a chemical abortion pill. So what this is mifepristone, which is basically a drug given to women to induce early pregnancy. It's going to cause your uterus to contract. It's also sometimes followed by misoprostol within the first 20 hours of taking the first pill, and I believe that just speeds up the process. They essentially tank your HCG and other pregnancy hormones so that your body can no longer support the embryo. If it's 10 weeks, it will have implanted. It will essentially unimplant it, and you will naturally deliver the baby within 4 to 24 hours of taking the pill. There will also be prolonged cramping and bleeding for the next 48 hours, according to some resources. However, anecdotal evidence is that this bleeding and cramping can last sometimes up to a month. And there's no checkups done on women to figure out why that's happening. The only checkup you receive after an abortion is to make sure you're not still pregnant. They don't really care about your emotional health or your overall reproductive health as long as you're not pregnant. Planned Parenthood says that this medicine causes cramping and bleeding that empties the uterus, which is true, albeit vague. The pregnancy tissue, i.e. your baby, will come out through your vagina, and the process is very similar to an early miscarriage. What? This process is very similar to an early miscarriage? Because it is! A miscarriage is a spontaneous natural abortion. You are literally inducing a miscarriage in a woman. You can't compare the two, because a miscarriage is a human being and it's a baby that was wanted. An abortion is the opposite. That gets me heated, but anyways, that's Planned Parenthood's take on all of it. The side effects include heavy bleeding, large clots, cramping, nausea, diarrhea, mild fever, and fatigue. Sometimes you can also have an allergic reaction, prolonged bleeding and cramping, and mental health side effects. Over half of all abortions in the US are via the pill nowadays. And if you are watching this and you know someone who is going to take a pill, has taken a pill, you're planning to take a pill, any of the above, abortionpillreversal.com. If you take the pill and you have regrets within that 4 to 24 hour period, call them. They can get you to the nearest clinic, and they have already been saving babies from the abortion pill. It can be reversed. So if you've taken the pill and regretted it, get your butt to a hospital, and these people will take care of you. Crazy life-saving care is being done with them. Week 11, all vital organs are in place and beginning to function. Week 12 is the end of the first trimester. 89% of all abortions happen within the first trimester. From conception to about the 16-week mark, you can also get a vacuum aspiration abortion, which was the norm before the abortion pill became a thing. And then at 16 weeks, it cuts off. What happens in a vacuum aspiration procedure? Doctors will use a gentle suction to remove the fetus from the uterus. The procedure isn't painful and lasts about 5 minutes. And this is on parents.com. Is giving this kind of vague information, but essentially what they're doing is putting a vacuum up there and just suctioning it right out. And we can actually look at an image of what is being suctioned out at 16 weeks. If you look at this image, this is a fully formed human baby. It's just smaller. It's just littler than the baby you would deliver at full term. Yeah, and at this point, the baby has all 10 fingers and toes, sex organs, a skull, rib cage, spinal cord, nerve endings. They can feel pain. They can move around. By week 20, their nervous system is completely developed. You are also halfway through your pregnancy, and you can feel the baby moving at this point in your pregnancy. Starting at 14 weeks and all the way through 24 weeks, or second trimester, you can get a DNE abortion, which is dilation and extraction. It is for larger pregnancies, as Planned Parenthood would call it, but it's for when the baby's larger, and just passing a blood clot isn't going to do it anymore. You need a lot more medical help. So what happens in a DNE extraction is that the cervix is dilated 24 hours before the procedure. So you're, once again, inducing early labor. using forceps and a suction tube. The baby's limbs are dismembered and then suctioned out of the womb because it can't fit in the vacuum anymore. Then they have to follow with a scraping tool to make sure that they've fully emptied the womb of the placenta and any fetal remains, because leftover baby, that sounds terrible to say. You're going to get an infection, basically. And they will often send you home within a few hours of this procedure. And once again, the only checkup you receive is to make sure you're not still pregnant. Then we hit week 24. The baby is about a foot in length, can hear noise outside of the womb. The respiratory system is fully developed to the point of potential viability outside of the womb with adequate support. And in most states now, this is the cutoff for when you can get an abortion. However, people have been advocating for years now to have an abortion all the way through 9 months. That's currently the law in New York City. They say that after 24 weeks, abortion is legal only if the fetus is not compatible with life or if necessary to preserve the mother's life or health. So there are restrictions, meaning you can't just get it for any reason, hypothetically, but anything in regards to the mother's life or health, it can be kind of vague, and it has been treated arbitrarily in the past. But even then, at this point, the reason for abortion is it's still arguable, right? Because most of the time, at this point, you are inducing early labor in a mother, and that has its own risks equal to the risks of carrying a baby to full term. And the doctor's code of ethics should be to preserve life and to preserve all life. So why not preserve the mother's life by, ending the pregnancy, so to speak, but you can also preserve the baby's life by delivering early and administering care. In regards to the baby not being compatible with life, I still just have a hard time with this one, because why would you end a life early just because someone's going to die? Like, that's the same as euthanasia in old people. That's like looking around at anyone our age and saying, well, she's going to die anyway. Oh, she has cancer. Might as well end it now. You're completely eliminating someone's ability to have any sort of shot at life or any chance. You're eliminating that baby's chance to be held by her mom and her dad, to know the sound of her mama's voice, because they know at that point, they hear sound outside of the womb. There is a bonding hormone that is released in both the mother and the baby after labor. It's a really cynical approach to life to say that a life should be ended for some reason other than there should be no reason. And we'll get into that later. But so what happens in a late term abortion post 24 weeks? Well, the mom is injected to induce early labor. They also have to inject the baby with intracardiac potassium chloride, which is meant to stop the heart. It is the same chemical given to inmates on death row. Then when the baby is dead, they will either dismember and suction out the remains or deliver the baby whole. Sometimes babies are still born alive after this procedure, and the ethics on whether or not a clinician should be required to administer care to a baby that survives an abortion are still being debated. There was a case in DC with the DC-5, I believe was what they were called. It was 5 babies, fully developed babies, that were found in some storage closet. They had essentially been thrown out, and there was evidence that they had survived an abortion and then were taken out and just left to die. And so far as I'm aware, nobody's been prosecuted for that because the baby wasn't wanted. And so, is it really murder? Which breaks my heart. So then there's the argument, okay, whatever, life begins at conception, or it begins whenever I want to say it begins, but that doesn't mean that it has value or that we could call it a person. If you're making this argument to me, I would like to ask you, what then makes a human being a person? Because human being is a scientific term. We are all human beings. We are never pregnant with anything other than a human being. It is biologically impossible at this point in human history. However, personhood is the philosophical term, and it's ultimately what we're debating. We got to stop this whole, it's not a human, it's not alive, because it is alive. It will continue to be alive until you stop it, and it is a human, because you can't be pregnant with anything else. So really what we were asking here is it a person? Is a baby in the womb a person? People will put it at sentience, which, like, are they able to feel emotions, feel pain, make decisions for themselves? What about, babies who can't fully make decisions for themselves? Humans, our frontal lobe doesn't even develop until we're 25. What about people under anesthesia who aren't conscious, or people who have gone into a vegetative state, or people who are in a coma, or who have dementia, or who have a mental impairment that can't fully cognitively function the way we would deem normal? So I just think that's a silly argument, personally, because you cannot determine when a human being gains sentience. So it's an arbitrary thing to give a human a value based on their level of consciousness or cognitive function. Some people will say dependability. If it's in the womb, like, it's my body, and this baby is relying on me for all of the resources it needs to live. So it's dependent on me. So I get to make the decision whether or not to continue to let it depend on me. Well, we hit that interesting point again, where what makes a baby in the womb less dependent on a mother than a baby who has just been born 5 minutes after? If you take a baby, you carry a baby to term and you leave it out to just fend for itself, that baby is going to die. They are equally as dependent on you just outside of the womb. Like, I don't know. I mean, I could see people making the argument of, like, well, at that point they're breathing on their own, they can eat on their own, like, they're genuinely not, connected to you through the umbilical cord, but still there are people on life support. There are people, once again, with impaired function, with disability, who are dependent every day on caretakers. There are children who depend on their parents to live. There are old people who are in nursing homes who depend on others to live. It is completely arbitrary, and I do not think a person's independence should determine their value as a human being. Lastly, we run into, like, ability, disability, and viability, meaning, like, how much medical assistance do they need? A lot of people say, well, yeah, you can deliver a baby early. Bro, oh, this one gets me. You can deliver a baby early, but they need serious medical intervention, so it's not fair. All right, I was in a terrible, terrible car crash, a life-ending car crash, but I need serious medical intervention, so you should just let me die. It's not fair. It's silly goose, bro. Silly cuckoo bananas goose. Because you're picking and choosing. Like, what's the difference of delivering a perfectly viable baby alive or dead? It's the wantedness of that person. I'm sure most of us would beg first responders to save a child or a loved one, or even a stranger on the street who is in need of serious medical care. We would beg them to save them. But here, because the baby is not wanted, it's okay to not give them that medical intervention. Additionally, disability or sex-based discrimination or racial discrimination. I cannot even begin to go into the amount of cases we've seen where they say, sorry, like, your baby's got Down syndrome. Your baby's got this, like, abnormality that's going to make life hard for them. You should just abort. Say that to any person who has lived with Down syndrome or another disability that has made their life harder. Tell them they should have died. You won't, right? You won't. Because it's not loving, it's not kind, it's completely arbitrary and discriminatory. I don't even know if I have it in this document, but, like, Planned Parenthood is the foundation of the abortion industry. So a lot of people talk about Planned Parenthood, and I know a lot of people are like, it's not just Planned Parenthood, they do other things, blah, blah, blah. It's abortion clinics as a whole. Okay, well, Margaret Sanger was a Nazi who wanted to genetically cleanse America from African Americans. So that's why we see the majority of abortion clinics, the highest population of abortion clinics, are in Black communities and neighborhoods. And that still remains true today. I'm not accusing of anyone of working at an abortion clinic of being a eugenicist, but that is what the industry is founded on. And so we can't be out here denying the fact that there is this certain amount of discrimination against people in the womb based on things like their race, their socioeconomic status, their ability versus disability, their cognitive function, their wantedness. Abortion is inherently discriminatory against a human being. What I arrived at in all of this research was that I think it is inconsistent to say that life truly begins at any point past conception. It has to begin at conception. It's scientifically been proven that it does start at conception. And if that's when life begins, then as a Christian, as someone who cares about human rights, someone who loves people, it's really hard for me to say that a human being is not a person for any of these arbitrary reasons besides the fact that they are alive. And that's where I fall on that. And I just don't think they should be denied that right to live by that same logic. It's in our Constitution, unalienable rights endowed by our Creator, meaning the right to life is not something the government gives us or should be able to give us. That is a severe humanitarian crisis if you're out here saying that the government should be deciding who lives and who dies, right? No person on earth should be able to give us the right to live. Like, you could argue, oh, well, when two people have sex, like, that's when a baby is formed. They gave that person life. Right, but they're not actively forming that life. They're not actively producing it and keeping it alive. Like, a mother's body will feed the baby, but she doesn't make it grow. That is a natural, unalienable, supernatural process that we will never be able to fully understand or control as human beings. And so I do believe that we have unalienable rights. The government cannot and should not be able to take those away from us. They are endowed by our Creator. And it is additionally the first of our three rights, meaning life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life comes first because you can't have the other two without life. And so to deny people a right to life is ultimately denying them the right to life, or to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So I just think every human deserves an equal shot at life, no matter who they are, where they're from, where they live or reside, what stage of development they're in, what race they are, what gender they are, whatever mental and physical capabilities they have, whatever level of health, socioeconomic status, or circumstances of conception. Every human being deserves an equal shot at life. And that is what I basically ran into. I was like, I can't come up with a good argument against this other than to deny something along this whole process we just went through. I'd have to be denying something, some type of person, their right to life in order to say that life, that someone is not a person at conception.